Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar, who's also a research analyst with the program, as well as our batchmate from our master's program, Harshit Sharma, who works on West Asia Studies with the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. In this episode, we're delving into the Iran-Saudi Arabia agreement on re-establishing diplomatic relations, which has caused quite a stir among commentators and analysts of geopolitics in the past 1 month. As many of our listeners would know, on 10th March, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China issued a joint statement that included an agreement to resume diplomatic relations between Riyadh and Tehran and reopen their embassies and missions within a period not exceeding 2 months in each other's country. And the agreement also included their affirmation of respect for the sovereignty of states and the non-interference in internal affairs of states. After almost 7 years of military and diplomatic hostility, the two Gulf powers agreed to work towards resolving their disagreements based on a set of international rules, and two bilateral agreements signed between them in 1998 and 2001. This year's agreement came after 5 days of comprehensive and intense negotiations in Beijing and 2 years of Saudi and Iran's closed-door talks in Iraq and Oman. The two sides also agreed that the ministers of foreign affairs of both countries shall meet to implement this, arrange for the return of their ambassadors, and discuss means of enhancing bilateral relations. And this meeting happened recently in Beijing on 6 April. With that brief account in mind, I'll come to you first, Harshit. What do you make of the deal? And should we be surprised that this came about at this juncture with China's help? What is the historical background of the negotiations like? Also, since you have written in the past on Iranian domestic politics and the Iranian perspective on West Asia, what do you think are the benefits for Iran in agreeing to this?
Hi, Anushka. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a privilege. As you rightly said, on 10th March, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China, they issued a joint trilateral statement stating that both the Gulf countries are to resume diplomatic ties and exchange ambassadors over the coming 2 months. And they did meet on 6th April 2023. I think this is not an ordinary development considering the long break in the diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh. But not just that, but also the choice of Beijing as the host and mediator is noteworthy. Both countries agreed to respect each other's sovereignty, and they also agreed to not interfere with each other's internal affairs in the NSA level meet on 10th March as well as on 6th April when the foreign ministers meet. They also agreed to implement the security cooperation agreement, which I think they signed in 2001, but it couldn't be implemented by then. And they also agreed to cooperate in other fields as well, trade, investment, economy. So I think the meeting of the foreign ministers of both the respective countries, it was a great event considering that they met almost after 7 years. And they discussed the key details of the agreement, and they also emphasized on mutually eliminating the obstacles facing the cooperation between them. And there are different obstacles. We will come to them later. And I think, all in all, I think it's a ray of hope, not only for the bilateral relations between Riyadh and Tehran, but as well as the regional peace and security in West Asia. And coming to the history, I think, post 1979, when the clerical regime took over Iran, I think the relations have been tensed between Saudi Arabia and Iran, especially because of the 1980 to 88, Iraq-Iran war. In fact, the formation of Gulf Cooperation Council in 1981 was the immediate effect or the outcomes of the Islamic government in Iran, because Saudi Arabia and the countries in the region, they wanted to form some kind of, a group to deal with the new and changed dynamics. And though there was a phase during the time of former president of Iran, Rafsanjani, in the 1990s, he was there from 1989 to 1997. At that time, since he came from the moderate faction of the Iranian Republic, Islamic Republic of Iran, so there was a sort of rapprochement at that time, but it couldn't last. There were two, three reasons I think for that. The coming of Ahmadinejad as the new Iranian president in 2005, and even before that, when Saddam Hussein was, his government was toppled in 2003. And so all these things, when Saddam Hussein was no longer there in power, I think that, really changed the regional balance of power in West Asia. So from that time, the relations have been not very friendly between the both the respective countries. But as we know, the relations really intensified. The bitterness really intensified when the Saudi, when a Shia cleric in Saudi Arabia was executed by the government. Nimr al Nimr was his name. He was executed in 2016, and after that, the Saudi embassy in Iran and the consulate in Mashhad, they were attacked by Iranian protesters. And many claim that they were not general protesters, but the Iranian government was behind them. So it was only after that incident that really, the relations really got bad. And it's been almost 7 years that, they were not, they finally exchanged, signed to exchange embassies. But as you rightly pointed out, it's not like came as a surprise, sort of surprise, and even before Beijing came into picture, Oman as well as Iraq, they were there. There were three or five round of talks between formal as well as informal between Iran and Saudi Arabia from 2021. So it shows in a way the willingness of the Saudi Arabia and Iran to normalize their relations. And I think if we now come to particularly about Iran, what is there for Iran to gain from this agreement? I think there are two three key things that Iran gains. I think first of all, it helps in countering regional grouping. See, given the fact that Iran is running proxy wars and supporting rebel groups in the region, Iran really does not have many trusted allies in the region. And there is an extent to which it can have sour relations with countries, particularly in the neighborhood, and it was indeed giving a rise to a regional grouping of countries against Iran post the signing of Abraham Accord. Even countries like Bahrain and UAE, they began a process of normalizing relations with Israel, a long time enemy state of Iran. But we were also seeing that back channel talks were going on between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and they were being facilitated by the USA. So, therefore, I think de escalation with Saudi Arabia was in favor of Iran in the present, especially because it would help undercut Israel's efforts to isolate Iran in the region. And that is what it has been doing for some time. And I think, in the light of these developments, Iran's willingness to ease its rivalry with Saudi Arabia can be seen as a policy of, some say strategic hedging, where Iran prepares for the worst by balancing Saudi Arabia, by maintaining a strong military presence in the region. But along with that, it does not close itself, from gaining whatever it can through constructive engagement with Saudi Arabia or other regions, other countries in the region. Other than that, I think it also helps Iran, and I think this is a crucial point. It really helps Iran countering internal distress. As we all know, post the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, in the custody of the morality police, Gashte Irshad, the anti-hijab protests raised some serious concerns for the regime. And even though the protests are not going on, these days, they have waned in recent weeks due to the brutal crackdown by the regime. But even then, they have not entirely died down. And there are many Iranian scholars who claim that the protests were again against the hijab law, but were not really limited to it. They were also in response to rising inflation, unemployment, large scale corruption, lack of opportunities for the youth, and in general the country's isolation in the world. So these are sort of concerns the Iranian population, particularly the younger Iranian population, have been raising for a very long time. And ever since, I think, the 2009 Green Movement, we have been raising, we have been listening to this slogan in almost every protest in Iran. The slogan is neither for Gaza nor for Lebanon. My soul is sacrificed for Iran, which generally means that the Iranian population does not want its government to spend the money in the region fighting proxy wars. The population wants the government to spend the money to better the infrastructure in the region, to create jobs, to create employment. You know, the money of the Iran population should remain in Iran and shouldn't be, spent in fighting regional wars. So I think this may have brought to light the deep seated unsatisfaction among the population, these protests. And the government might be realizing that to alleviate the economic hardships, the government has to have money in its disposal to fix the economy and to generate employment and jobs. So I think one way to do this, the Iranian regime might have thought that to restore diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. So the huge amount of money that was being spent in Yemen, in Lebanon, Syria, so that money could be saved and can rather be used here in the country. And other than that, I think an agreement with Saudi Arabia would help cement its ties with other members as well of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And since the GCC came into existence because of the formation of IRI, and I think the agreement would come as an immediate relief for the Iranian government, which has been facing protests in recent months. So I think these are the two key issues why Iranian government, might have agreed to sign this agreement.
Right. Thanks. Thanks so much, Harshit, for that absolutely elaborate background on the history of negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, how we came about to see the current kind of joint trilateral agreement from March. And it's brilliant that your history went way back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Thank you also for throwing some light on the couple reasons as to why this deal is a good deal for Iran to take. With that, I'll go on to Amit and sort of pose my second question, which is about Saudi Arabia. So we also see that during during Xi Jinping's visit to Riyadh last year, Saudi went ahead and requested Beijing to play the role of a mediator in its talks and ties with Iran. And this kind of shows some endeavor, some excitement on Saudi's part to actually bring peace in its relations with Iran and put an end to the diplomatic, economic, and military hostility between the two countries. In that light, what reason and rationale do we see on Riyadh's front in its engagement with this agreement with Iran and China, and what benefits, what advantages does it carry for Saudi Arabia? Amit, your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Anushka. So I feel Mohammed bin Salman has been a significant factor in Saudi's inclination for a diplomatic restoration with Iran. So ever since MBS has taken the reign of Saudi leadership, he has promoted a vision for Saudi Arabia, which got concretized in the form of Vision 2030 for Saudi Arabia. He's looking to diverse, and he has taken a number of steps which were hitherto not not imagined by many of the observers. And also, he's looking to diversify the economy of his nation away from the one that is currently dominated by oil exports. To this end, he needs investments and is inviting cooperation from other countries toward this end. And political stability is one thing, that is a prerequisite to infuse investor confidence in the economy. But this continuous and prolonged tension and war, proxy war with Iran that has manifested itself in terms of proxy war in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon was proving to be a hindrance. And so the economic vision that MBS had for Saudi Arabia was in a way suffering because of this decades-old rivalry. Secondly, the second factor that I think the trick here was tensions in Yemen, where Saudi supports the UN recognized government in Behadi, against Iranian backed Houthis was always a national security concern, given Saudi shares land border with Yemen and Iran doesn't. Constant attacks by Houthis, including the ones on Saudi's oil facilities, were proven to be a real and tangible national security concern for the Saudis and MBS. It indeed affected Saudi more than it did Iran. And the war that Saudi led against the Iranian backed Houthis was into its fifth year, I think, and with no real signs of gain or favorable outcome. Saudi did not manage to displace the Houthis from Sanaa, capital of Yemen, after all these years and efforts, war efforts. Saudi had failed to coerce Iran into a settlement through its military operations in Yemen. And so, amidst there was a growing willingness from this prolonged war, Saudi had been lately very inclined towards solution and settlement with the Houthis and the Iranians. In fact, there have been whispers, according to the U.S. intelligence of the Saudi Houthi deal that they intended to sign, but the Saudis were holding off, maybe waiting for direct talks with Iran. And this opportunity came as she visited Saudi Arabia, Riyadh last month. So these are the two factors. Thirdly, not very convincing argument, but few observers believe that Saudi and MBS were looking to diversify partners away from the US, especially a lot had been not, especially given a lot have not had not been okay between the US Saudi relations, and there were growing tensions following MBS handling of Jamal Khashoggi's death. And therefore, there was this urge within Saudi leadership to seek some autonomy in the region away from the US. And maybe these three reasons why Saudi Arabia thought this deal was a necessary one with Iran.
Right, that makes sense. And I do have some thoughts on why Saudi may indeed have asked China to assume a mediator role when President Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December last year. So, as you mentioned, Saudi would have desperately wanted a rapprochement with Iran for a host of reasons, the most important being MBS's Vision 2030 and the national security concerns arising from the proxy war with the Houthis at its border. And when last year, as Harshit pointed out, there were discussions going on in Iraq between Saudi and Iran already. And when last year Iraqi politics intruded and the new Prime Minister Sudani, who replaced Kadhimi, showed little interest in continuing Iraq's role as a mediator and also did not enjoy the same level of trust as Saudi. Saudi kind of was left with only China as an option for it to assume the role of a mediator. And so, for all the discussion surrounding China's role in quote unquote brokering peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and rather the hyping up of this role, needs to also take into account the historical process that was already underway in Saudi Arabia and Iran's relationship. At the same time, one cannot underplay the role China has undertaken here, because like Harshit mentioned, this was quite a momentous agreement to reach, and it was underway for a long time. And even though Xi Jinping and China have been opportunistic in this context, they have really leveraged it well and have led the agreement to come about in the nature and way that it has in March. And of course, the slew of events was also lucky for China, because first Xi Jinping visited Riyadh in December 2022, and then soon after that, in February 2023, the Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi visited China and met Xi. And even there, Iran found Saudi Arabia's proposal for the resumption of ties acceptable, and this proposal was put forward to Iran by China.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Historically, we see that China has shied away from direct involvement in conflict or taking a stance on conflict and thorny disputes in the Middle East and in the African region, and hasn't really been motivated to challenge or go into direct conflict with US presence and US predominance in the Middle Eastern region. And so this change in approach where China has kind of actively mediated the Saudi Iranian normalization agreement is somehow welcomed by regional actors for various reasons. One is that they all hope to finally bury the hatchet of a decades long rivalry, as we have already discussed. They're also frustrated by the failed stabilization efforts in the various proxy wars across the region, like Amit, you mentioned Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. And they've also often called into question the viability of US administration led efforts in bringing about peace to the region, especially since their strategic withdrawal from Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, and beyond. And so, in that sense, China's proactive approach is now welcome. And many are touting this agreement between Saudi and Iran, brokered by China, as a win for the global security initiative. So, the readers that may be interested in knowing, the Global Security Initiative is one of the flagship foreign policy programs that China has come out with at the Bao Forum for Asia annual conference in 2022. And what it does is it seeks to address complex and intertwined security challenges in a people-centric manner, and it wants to create a win-win approach for all the countries involved. And Wang Yi also hailed the coming about of this normalization agreement as a victory for dialogue and peace, and he's setting it out as an example for the successful practice of the strong implementation of the Global Security Initiative. And I would personally take this with a pinch of salt, because the biggest drawback the Global Security Initiative has faced is that it is vague and too broad in its laying down of concepts. On one hand, it talks about some of the principles that have indeed been agreed in the normalization agreement, which is respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. And on the other hand, it kind of talks about creating a security architecture that is centered around China's interests, if not directly, in a manner that is indirect and yet elaborate. And so the vagueness of GSI, as well as its China centricity, kind of tells us that we have to see the implementation of GSI as a learning by doing process, rather than a process where a couple of tenets have already been listed out and everything that China does next will kind of fulfill one of those listed tenets. So in that regard, yes, the Saudi-Iran deal can be seen as an example for a starting process of how the GSI can be seen as implemented in future deals, but shouldn't necessarily be seen as a success for the initiative itself. And finally, some thoughts on the US reaction to the brokering of the deal. I think the US has reacted in a very mature and moderate manner by arguing that the deal is a good thing for the region, the deal is a good thing for Iran, for Saudi Arabia, for China, and for the US. And the US national security and foreign policy officials have expressed optimism, albeit they have been cautious in saying that, because if you look at the statement made by John Kirby of the National Security Council, he says that the US welcomes the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, it really does remain to be seen whether the Iranians are going to honor their side of the deal because of the confrontational relationship between US and Iran. So yes, I would like to say that there is some cautious optimism that US officials have expressed without necessarily arguing against the role China has played in the same.
I would like to add to that. There have been concerns by several observers that this deal might indicate the lowering or treat or a geopolitical loss for the US vis-a-vis China. But I don't think that is the case, because even if I were to accept that China is assuming a larger role in the West Asia, which I think is slightly overstated, it frees US's attention to focus. It allows China to take some responsibility for stability in West Asia and frees up US's attention to focus more in Indo-Pacific, which is, I think, in the interest of the Indians and other concerning parties such as Japan, South Korea, and other ASEAN countries.
If I may add to Amit's point, I think Chinese mediation between Iran and Saudi Arabia conveys a significant change, in the regional geopolitics of West Asia. It's very important to realize that China as a mediator has been acceptable to Saudi Arabia and Iran, because both of these countries enjoy, a strong relationship with it. And although China has traditionally maintained ties with Gulf countries, only mainly on trade and energy issues. But in recent times, it has made statements on the regional security issues in the Gulf as well. And the successful Chinese mediation looks like a beginning of a new era of Chinese influence in the Gulf. After successfully mediating this Iran Saudi rapprochement, Beijing has recently also offered Israel and Palestine to mediate between their issue. So I think to be able to maintain its presence in the US dominated Gulf, I think would be the real litmus test for China.
Right. I'll come to my final set of questions. This has been a very insightful chat looking at the deal from various vantage points. And this set of questions is for both Harshit and Amit. Harshit, I'll hand on the floor to you first. So, what do we see this deals, this agreements impact being on the West Asian regional order? How will it influence power dynamics in the region? And what are the challenges to the actualization of peace in the deal? We hear so much about this being a peace deal, and this being, like you said, Harshit, the coming about of a new era in Saudi Iran relations as well in the region. So what do we see as impacts on the regional order, and what do we see as challenges to the achievement of this peace that we're referring to in the context of this agreement? Harshit?
To respond to your first question, I think it's very evident that the move is extremely important for its regional geopolitics implications. Both the countries have been, locked in a bitter geopolitical rivalry for decades, and Tehran has used its, Shia identity and sectarian divisions in the region and insecurity among several groups and communities. It has ingrained to gain strategic influence in the region. Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, we have many examples. And on the other hand, Saudi Arabia has also tried to gain influence in these countries, by backing different rival groups over the years. And but it's very important to understand that so far, at least in my assessment, the Saudi Arabia has arguably been outmaneuvered by Iran. And I think that's why geopolitically, this agreement is more important for Saudi Arabia than it is for Iran. And I think the major focus of this deal, I think, if implemented fully, this agreement has a potential to substantially improve the Yemen situation. It can end the Saudi military operation in Yemen. It can start, improving the humanitarian situation in the country, rebuild its economy, create employment, jobs. And but I think it's very important to understand that the local factors, independent of Iran and Saudi Arabia, may continue to create tensions in the country. It's not as if the Houthi groups are totally in control of Iran. So that's a challenge, and the time will tell, how this deal results in that point. And I think, the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia is an important development. But, while not diminishing the importance of the development, it is too early to suggest that the announcement will lead to a serious rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And, but nevertheless, the agreement is a positive move to break the impasse. But a lot depends upon maintaining the momentum and the, how we gain the results of the talks.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
cooperation over, I think, non-controversial issues, just trade investment culture, we can see them, taking place very soon. But matters will take time and require more negotiations and the trust between them when it comes to the security issues.
Right. Thanks for that, Harshit. Amit, your thoughts on this?
Right. So for me, the challenge that I see arising from this peace deal, a possible challenge, is in any peace deal you see, there's always a need of an honest broker, peace guarantor. We saw that in the Abrahamic Accords or any of the peace accord you pick up. You'll see always there's always a presence of a peace guarantor that plays a neutral party. Challenge that I see in this peace deal is whether China will be able to play the role of an honest broker, neutral party, and how far is China willing to go to ensure that this deal sustains. So, for example, if the Chinese or the Iranians are unwilling to make some concessions in Yemen or Lebanon, with regards to the Houthis. And there's also a question if the Iranians are in complete control of the Houthis, then what are the options that the Chinese have to ensure that this peace deal holds? And so this will be a challenge. This will be a question for me to look at. And with regards to role of China as that of an honest probe.
Right, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I do echo those sentiments that perhaps it's too early to assess the merits of the deal and whether or not it will indeed be able to broker the peace that years of military conflict in the region has kind of ushered in. With that, we'll come to the end of the podcast. Thank you so much, Harshit and Amit, for your insightful comments. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to yet another episode of All Things Policy. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.